The man woke suddenly from his sleep, only to find his fingers trembling uncontrollably, guiding his body toward his wife's room. He jerked his arms back to his chest, but his legs began moving on their own, as if driven by some invisible force. He fought desperately to control the restless movements, only to realize with growing horror that his abdomen was rising and falling violently, like something inside was writhing, forcing him forward. He leaned heavily against the wall, using his full weight to resist the pull urging him onward. With great effort, he managed to halt the motion. But then, the door to his wife's room slowly creaked open, and she approached him in an eerie, unnatural way. The moment their hands touched, a horrifying transformation took place. Bones twisted and fused together with a sickening crunch, and excruciating pain flooded his entire body. What could have caused such a bizarre fusion between them? The answer goes back to a seemingly ordinary decision made just 1 month earlier. Night fell, and the city's neon lights marked the end of another day in Tim and Millie's urban life. After nearly a decade together, this couple was ready to leave behind the noise and rush of the big city and start fresh in a quiet, remote rural town. Tim was a 35-year-old man who still held tightly to his rock and roll dreams. No matter how many times reality had crushed those dreams, his eyes always sparkled with that same passion for music. Millie, on the other hand, was completely different, gentle, grounded, and practical. She was about to begin work as a teacher in their new town, ready to provide a stable income with her professional skills. In their relationship, she was always the more rational and responsible one. Friends threw them a farewell party filled with laughter and hugs, weaving a final tapestry of well wishes. But beneath the surface of joy, both Tim and Millie carried their own worries. Excitement for the future mixed with lingering attachments to the past, making this goodbye feel heavy and bittersweet. A few days later, with hearts full of complicated emotions, the couple arrived at their new home. At the end of a quiet country lane stood a simple, unassuming house. Surrounding it were rolling hills and dense forests, a stark contrast to the steel and concrete of the city they had left behind. Morning sunlight filtered through the pine trees, casting a peaceful glow over the front yard. But that calm was short-lived. While unpacking in the new home, Tim suddenly caught a sharp, unpleasant smell. Following the scent upward, he realized it was coming from the ceiling light fixture. Furrowing his brow, he grabbed a ladder and carefully unscrewed the lampshade, only to find a rotting dead mouse inside. Worse yet, its tail was tangled with several others. Battling his nausea, Tim cleaned up the disgusting mess and quickly threw it outside. The next day, Millie headed to the town school to start her new job. A colleague named Jamie struck up a conversation, friendly and curious. The two hit it off immediately, with none of the awkwardness of strangers. Jamie was surprised to learn they were actually neighbors, living on the same road. Millie couldn't help but smile at the coincidence. Jamie warmly introduced Millie to the area surrounding their new town. She mentioned that although their home was remote, it was nestled among dense forests and winding trails, perfect spots for walks and relaxation. Jamie suggested that Millie and Tim take some time to explore to help themselves settle into the slower pace of this close-knit community. Back at home, Tim was focused on preparing for an upcoming band gig. Millie walked over and quietly suggested they take a stroll along a nearby mountain path to get familiar with their new surroundings. Tim nodded in agreement. The next morning, Millie and Tim set out on their first hike in the town. The forest trail twisted and turned beneath their feet, the fallen leaves soft and damp. As they ventured deeper, the path abruptly ended in a dead end. Millie started to wonder if they had missed a crucial fork in the trail, but Tim noticed a weathered copper bell hanging among the leaves ahead. He believed it marked a hidden path and led Millie onward. Strangely, similar bells appeared at regular intervals along the way, almost identical, as if deliberately placed as a guide, or perhaps remnants of some ancient ritual. Intrigued, they pressed forward. Before long, a sudden downpour erupted without warning. The two decided to turn back, but quickly realized they had lost track of the path they came from. Tim insisted on pushing forward in a southeast direction, while Millie grew increasingly tired and anxious. The tension between them thickened, and the surrounding forest seemed to silently watch their every move. In the middle of their argument, Tim suddenly slipped and fell into a pit. Terrified, he grabbed onto a massive copper bell hanging on the edge. Millie reached out to catch him, but was pulled in alongside him. Thankfully, neither of them was seriously hurt, just soaked and out of breath. The rain showed no signs of stopping, and with no way out of the forest, they reluctantly decided to stay in the pit for shelter and wait for the weather to clear. Tim walked to a small pool of water and filled an empty bottle with what little rainwater had collected. Parched and exhausted, they barely hesitated before sharing the precious water between them. Soon after, they worked together to build a fire. The blazing warmth chased away the dampness and cold. When morning came, sunlight filtered through the cave entrance, gently rousing them from restless sleep. The storm had passed, and the world outside had returned to peaceful calm. Millie joked that only Tim could sleep so soundly in such a damp, uncomfortable spot. However, just as they were about to stand and leave, they suddenly discovered that their legs were stuck together by some kind of sticky, slimy substance. Carefully, they pulled apart, trying to identify the strange residue, but they couldn't figure out what had caused it. Despite the unsettling experience, they chose not to dwell on it and soon pushed it out of their minds. They climbed out of the pit and began their journey home. Once back, everything on the surface seemed normal. Tim continued preparing for his upcoming show, and Millie returned to her teaching duties at the school. But subtle changes soon began to creep into their daily lives. One day, while showering, Tim suddenly lost consciousness. His body flailed uncontrollably, crashing against the bathroom walls in the direction Millie was driving the car. We finally came to, he was soaked, cold, and terrified. In a panic, he rushed to the town clinic for a checkup. The doctor, confronted with these sudden symptoms, tried to offer a psychological explanation. He suggested Tim might be experiencing anxiety or a panic attack. Being in a new environment under extreme stress, combined with feelings of isolation, could easily amplify the tension in his mind, eventually triggering a physical stress response. Tim didn't agree with the doctor's assessment. He firmly denied that his symptoms had anything to do with his mental state and rejected the doctor's next suggestion outright. The doctor had mentioned Tim's mother's history of mental illness, proposing that a genetic predisposition might be influencing his current condition. Tim clearly bristled at the implication. He refused to discuss that part of his past any further, emphasizing that he was not his mother and was tired of dredging up memories that had already been revisited countless times. Seeing this, the doctor backed off from probing deeper and instead prescribed a muscle relaxant. He explained that the medication could calm overactive central nervous system activity and break the cycle of tension between the brain and body, allowing the muscles to relax and preventing panic attacks from escalating. Before finishing, the doctor mentioned something chilling. Not long ago, a couple had disappeared in those very woods, and they were still missing. The town had posted missing person notices. Back home, Tim began searching for news about the case. To his shock, he discovered that the couple had vanished exactly where they had hiked just the day before. Just then, the doorbell rang. Millie opened the door to find their neighbor, Jamie, standing there, holding a bottle of red wine. This friendly, outgoing colleague came bearing a gift, hoping to officially welcome them to the community. Millie warmly invited him inside. Though he politely declined at first, Jamie eventually settled in. What started as casual chit-chat soon shifted toward more sensitive topics. Millie shared their experience of getting lost in the forest and the rain-trapped cave. Jamie seemed unsurprised and casually reminded them that their phones actually had built-in compasses. When Tim mentioned the giant bell in the cave and the stone benches that looked like church pews, the mood turned tense. He described the place as having the eerie vibe of a cult ritual, dark, creepy, and definitely not a natural formation. Jamie explained that the area used to be home to a small chapel, but had long since fallen into ruin years ago. As the building crumbled, the congregation dispersed, and the place gradually slipped into obscurity. After Jamie left, Tim half-joked that he thought Jamie might be interested in Millie. Millie just laughed and denied it. After a few teasing remarks, the mood suddenly shifted. Tim seemed to lose consciousness for a moment and impulsively kissed Millie. But when they pulled apart, their lips felt strangely stuck together. The instant they tore apart, a sharp, searing pain shot through both of them, causing them to scream out in shock. Millie angrily asked if Tim had bitten her, while Tim himself fell off but couldn't explain why. Later that night, Millie was jolted awake by the sensation of her hair being pulled. Frowning with half-open eyes, she tried to wake Tim, who lay completely still. Instinctively, she flicked on the bedside lamp and gasped in horror. Tim's mouth was tightly clamped around her long hair, as if something inside him was trying to swallow it whole. Panicked, Millie screamed, snapping Tim out of his trance. He looked bewildered as he yanked her hair free from deep in his throat, utterly clueless about what had just happened. The next morning, Tim was getting ready to leave for his gig. Millie, worried about his strange behavior, urged him to stay. She brought up the bizarre incident from the night before. Tim tried to explain that he'd been foggy-headed, but Millie's frustration grew. She felt he was dodging responsibility. In the end, Millie decided to give Tim some space. She suggested he skip coming home that night, go to a party, and stay with friends to unwind. Tim sensed her coldness and mood swings, but quietly accepted her offer. Alone at the station, a wave of unexplained panic washed over Tim. He tried to calm himself with medication, but instead of helping, it made his heartbeat race even more wildly. Unable to contain the restless turmoil inside, he dropped his bags and sprinted toward Millie's school like a man possessed. Out of breath, he burst onto campus just as Millie was finishing her class, packing up to leave. A student's drawing caught her eye, but before she could focus, she spotted Tim outside the classroom. She led him to the restroom, anxiously demanding to know what was wrong. Tim said nothing. Suddenly, without warning, he kissed her. But once again, their lips stuck together. To avoid being noticed, they forced themselves apart, swallowing the awkwardness and pain. At that moment, Jamie appeared at the door, knocking and asking if everything was all right. Millie forced herself to stay calm and brushed him off. But once they were home, Millie finally broke down. She confronted Tim, demanding if he even realized what he'd just done, nearly costing her job and possibly landing her in jail. Tim fired back, insisting he hadn't forced her, that she had willingly gone along. The argument quickly escalated. Millie accused him of being a failure who always hid behind his dream chasing as an excuse to avoid responsibility. Tim retaliated, reminding her that he'd moved here for her sake, giving up everything. Millie didn't hold back, mocking his so-called music dreams and even challenging him to go perform. The tension peaked as Millie shouted for Tim to leave, telling him that if he truly felt trapped, he should just get out. But Tim's voice cracked, and he couldn't bring himself to leave. He lowered his head, broken, quietly admitting that something was wrong with him, like his body and mind were disconnected. Millie looked at him without a word, then turned away coldly. The rift between them had grown too deep to mend. Later that evening, Millie found herself standing outside Jamie's door, wanting to apologize for what happened earlier in the bathroom. Jamie waved off the awkwardness with a casual, "It's a woman's thing," and invited her inside. Feeling a bit more at ease, Millie opened up about how out of sync she and Tim had become. Since moving, things had only worsened, and she'd begun to wonder if their relationship had long been broken. Only neither of them wanted to admit it. Faced with Jamie's gentle concern, Millie hesitated but admitted she still loved Tim. The relationship had simply lasted so long that she barely remembered what life without him was like. Maybe they weren't broken, just stuck in a comfortable routine. Jamie softly shared a metaphor he often used in class, inspired by Plato. He explained how the ancient Greeks believed humans were originally creatures with 4 arms, 4 legs, and 2 faces. Fearing their power, Zeus split them in half, and ever since, people spent their lives searching for their other half. If you've already found that person, he said quietly, don't let go of them easily. Those words made Millie thoughtful. She casually asked if Jamie was living alone in the house. After a brief hesitation, he admitted that he and his partner had bought the place together. They were around the same age as Millie and Tim and had faced similar struggles and arguments. Jamie shared that he had once chosen to leave, briefly feeling an unprecedented sense of freedom and relief. But that freedom quickly turned into loneliness. He didn't do anything in particular. He just felt hollow and in pain, even started to miss the very arguments he once dreaded. At that moment, Millie seemed to realize that the value of some relationships didn't lie in their perfection, but in the willingness to stay and face the imperfections together. Jamie mentioned a wedding video stored at home, something he'd never found the right reason to play, but Millie politely declined, saying it was time to go home. Later that night, Millie returned home, still unsettled. After apologizing, Tim went back to his studio to focus on work. Suddenly, a loud noise startled him, causing his notebook to fall to the floor. He whipped around and saw Millie pounding on the door with her head, seemingly in a trance. No matter how much he called out, she didn't respond. In desperation, Tim slapped her. Millie snapped back to reality, but had no memory of what had just happened. Tim nervously asked Millie if she might have had a seizure, even wondering if she was sleepwalking. Millie suggested it could be stress-related, but Tim only grew more uneasy. He recalled their experience in the cave and sensed that something had changed in him ever since. Now, Millie was starting to show strange symptoms too. He became increasingly convinced that whenever their minds were exhausted, their bodies seemed to be taken over by another consciousness. A chilling thought struck him. The couple who had vanished in the woods had walked the same path. He suspected something unexplainable had happened in that cave, and they were slowly falling into the same abyss. Millie tried to rationalize and dismiss Tim's theories, but his words began to shake her resolve. Tim remembered the weird incident that morning, when their skin had stuck together. At first, they'd assumed it was mold, but Tim questioned himself. How could they be so sure it was mold when they didn't even know what mold really was? What was even more disturbing was what happened after they got close again at school. They simply couldn't separate, as if something invisible was binding them tightly. Millie tried to blame the discomfort on their long period of intimacy being broken, but Tim proposed an experiment. He held out his hand, asking Millie to bring hers close. Tim was certain it wasn't a coincidence, but some kind of magnetic force. Millie refused to accept it and insisted Tim sleep in the guest room that night. Tim agreed, knowing they needed some distance. As Millie turned to leave, she suddenly stopped in her tracks. Tim blurted out a heartbreaking realization. Everything was becoming increasingly irrational. He couldn't fully explain it, but the strange resonance between them was undeniably real. It was like some unknown force had implanted a connection deep within them. Tim grew certain it all originated from that cave. Determined to find answers, he decided to return there the next day. After they went to separate rooms to sleep, the quiet night was soon disturbed once more by something eerie. Tim's body began moving against his will, inching toward Millie's room. When he snapped awake, he realized his fingers had transformed into claw-like grips, digging fiercely into the floor as if dragging him forward. He suddenly raised his arms only to find his feet moving on their own, driven by some invisible will. Desperately, Tim fought to control his limbs, but then he felt his abdomen heave violently, as if something alive was writhing inside, forcing him onward. He had to brace himself against the wall, using all his strength to resist the relentless pull, and barely managed to stop. Just then, Millie's bedroom door slowly creaked open. She approached him in an eerie, unnatural way, as if controlled by some unseen force. When she finally snapped awake, she realized her body was no longer entirely her own. Tim shouted for her to hold on, but in the next instant, both of them lost control and were drawn toward each other. As their hands touched, a horrifying transformation occurred. Their bones twisted and fused with a sickening crunch. Agonizing pain swept through their bodies. Millie screamed, her eyes wide with terror and despair, whispering that she didn't want to live anymore. Tim fought to keep her conscious. In the midst of their desperate struggle, Tim suddenly thought of the muscle relaxants. Maybe they could ease these abnormal physical reactions. Millie handed him the medication, and without hesitation, Tim took it by a more intense method to speed its effect. They used their feet to push against each other, exerting every ounce of strength to force distance between their bodies. Every second felt like a life-or-death tug of war. Though Millie admitted she couldn't hold on, she gritted her teeth and persevered. Tim kept encouraging her, and together, with the last of their strength, they pushed apart again and again, fighting to maintain their physical separation. In this chaotic, painful battle of wills, they repeatedly told each other not to give up. Time ticked by slowly, each second draining both their minds and bodies until finally, exhausted and defeated, they both collapsed unconscious in the empty hallway. When Tim came to, he found himself tied to a chair, with Millie standing nearby, a chainsaw resting ominously on the table in front of her. They had succeeded last night. Their arms were fused, connected by a layer of skin. Millie was determined to force them apart. After forcing a shot of alcohol down Tim's throat, she prepared to get to work. Tim tried to stop her, but feeling the tremors running through his arm, he realized that if they didn't separate now, there would be no turning back. Once the wound was bandaged, Millie planned to head to the hospital, only to discover she had left the car keys at Jamie's house. To keep their distance, she decided to go alone. After Millie left, Tim made up his mind to return to the cave and seek answers. Millie arrived at Jamie's place, only to find the house eerily empty. She cautiously scanned the rooms and stepped inside, searching for the keys. Suddenly, a faint noise came from the back room. She crept closer and discovered a strange video playing. The footage showed a group of people walking hand in hand into an old, crumbling church. Hanging above the church's entrance was the very same copper bell they had seen earlier in the cave. Meanwhile, Tim ventured alone to the cave, where he discovered a disturbing mural etched into the stone wall. The images eerily mirrored the horrifying fusion they had experienced, sending chills down his spine. Back at Jamie's house, Millie continued watching the unsettling footage. The video showed Jamie and a lover, dressed in wedding attire, performing a ceremony inside the old church and exchanging rings. The couple then descended slowly into the depths beneath the building. By a pool of water, they drank deeply, and their bodies began rapidly merging in a grotesque, terrifying transformation. Suddenly, the video cut off, and Jamie appeared behind Millie. Shocked, she spun around and demanded, "What is going on here?" At that moment, Tim focused intently on deciphering the strange symbols in the cave mural. But then, from the darkness, a hand lunged out and knocked him to the ground. His body quickly became ensnared in a viscous, adhesive substance seeping from the earth, rendering him immobile. From a shadowy corner, a grotesque, fused creature crawled forward, its twisted limbs and writhing form revolting. Tim recognized the monster. It was the missing couple from the news reports. Terrified, he fought with every ounce of strength to break free. Finally, he escaped the creature's grasp and fled for his life. Jamie used a sharp ring to slash a deep cut across Millie's arm, attempting to fuse with her. But in a sudden burst of pain and fear, Millie fought back fiercely, delivering a loud, stinging slap that sent Jamie sprawling to the ground. Taking advantage of the moment, she scrambled out of the house as fast as she could. Outside, she spotted Tim, looking battered and worn. Instantly alert, Millie shouted for him to stay back, not wanting him to come any closer. Tim dropped to one knee and finally confessed the feelings he'd been suppressing for so long. He admitted he had been terrified of losing her, terrified of facing his true self alone. But now, he knew clearly how empty and painful life had been without Millie by his side. He confessed to wasting too much time chasing unrealistic dreams and fantasizing about a different life. It wasn't until this moment that he understood Millie was the real dream he had been meant to live. Filled with guilt over his late awakening, yet strengthened by a newfound certainty in his love, Tim bared his soul. Just as this raw confession seemed to hang in the air, ready to become goodbye, Tim softly urged Millie to close her eyes. He didn't want her to witness what was coming next, or to carry more pain. He understood that ending this nightmare would require sacrifice, that the only way to stop the horrific fusion was for one of them to die. So Tim chose to bear the weight of fate alone. Millie desperately tried to stop him, pleading again and again for him to drop the tool in his hand. But Tim's resolve was unshakable. Just as he was about to act, he was startled to see Millie's blood quietly merging with his own. Before he could fully react, Millie collapsed to the floor, weakened by severe blood loss. Her breathing grew faint, then finally stopped altogether. Tim gently carried Millie back inside.
It's the only way to stop the bleeding. What?
He took out the record they both loved, the very song they had once imagined would be their wedding dance. As the music began to play, the two slowly moved closer together, crossing the boundary between life and death to embrace once more. Though they could no longer return to the life they once knew, they used this final dance to say their goodbyes. When the music faded, silence returned to the room. But this silence wasn't the stillness of death. It was the calm before a new form of life was born. In that remote town, another couple completed a mysterious transformation from two individuals into a singular entity. They were no longer Tim and Millie as separate people, but a new being, one with both their memories, emotions, and experiences, yet transcending the limits of individuality. This existence went beyond traditional human understanding. It was neither life nor death, but a deeper state of unity. Not long after, Millie's parents came to visit.